start our panel A, called Remembrance, History, Image, Theories and Cognitive Perspectives. I have already introduced myself. I'm Joanna Wawrzyniak, University of Warsaw. I will chair the panel, and I will introduce the speaker. I will introduce each speaker before the speaker presents. The idea is that each of the speakers have 20 minutes for the presentations. Then we'll have our commentator, Luiza, Nader, and then at the end we'll open the floor for the discussion. So our first speaker is Vitalii Ogiienko, who works in the academic department of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance and teaches the undergraduate course Memory and Trauma, Concepts and Research Approaches at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He studied history and completed his candidate dissertation at history at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. His current project, titled Holodomor as a Historical Trauma, aims to look at the biggest Ukrainian tragedy in terms of various trauma studies approaches. And you will present some of your research right now. So the floor is yours. You can go there if you need to use your PowerPoint.
Thank you, Joanna. And I would like to tell you a story of this young lady. I call it the starving little girl, but official name is different. It is a bitter memory of childhood. And as you understand, this story will be about Holodomor, the biggest tragedy in Ukrainian history, who took almost 4 million lives. The story of little girl was created by Ukrainian sculptor Petro Poroshenko in the middle of 2010s. And let's look at it in more thoroughly, more carefully. Of course, first of all, we see these eyes and this oval of legs. They seem to me very, very special. This girl is barefoot. She keeps several sticklets of wheat in her hands. The description on the postaments says to those died alive and unborn, and it is the words of Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko. You see the apples on the postaments, and it is old Ukrainian and Orthodox practice to leave food near the graves of those who were dead. Of course, at this place we don't have any graves. Originally, the sculpture is located at Holodomor Memorial to Holodomor victims, and it is several pictures from this place. This place is very traumatic and full of a lot of different signs. Orthodox signs, religious signs. You see, for example, angels, crosses, birds, and if you want to count them, I think it will be more than 10 or even more than 20. It is really very symbolic place. And it is place of official commemoration and place where foreign visitors should go in order to commemorate the victims of Holodomor. It is President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, is looking at little girls, or vice versa. She is looking at it in the language of faith is very, very interesting. It is impossible to say what he is thinking about, but it is really something very important. And you see on the second picture the president of Poland near on his knees near the starving little girl. This image has really viral spreading. This image is taken in Canada, and in Canada we have two statues located near Legislative of Manitoba and the Canada Museum for Human Rights. And at that corner, poster of one event dedicated to Holodomor. It was a scientific conference, and you see this man. It is a very famous scholar who researched Holodomor, and you see near the little statuette of a starving little girl. Memory of Holodomor, it has passed nearly 85 years, and next year will be 85 years anniversary of Holodomor, and this is really very painful memory, really important memory for Ukrainians. And this picture you can see this girl may be like a goddess, and people praying near her and bowing own heads. But I'm not so interested in discourse of or connected to this image, or simply cultural phenomenon connected to this image of a starving little girl. It is part of my brother's project, which is called Holodomor and Historical Drama, and generally speaking, it is attempt to trace memory development in different terms. For example, in terms of images, memory, different content, from some original experience that is 32-33 to nowadays. And logic of this, I look at this historical drama in vertical dimension. Which comes from original experience and to nowadays. That is from meaning, collective memory or image, to information, cultural memory, media icon. That is in terms of Serge Moscovici, for example, from meaning to information. And it is general logic of this process, memory development. We cannot say that all content which is passed over is the same. No, of course. It can be different, and presumably if we going from repeating these traumatic impulses to working it out, something can be changed. And of course, presumably it is the situation when some additional meaning can be added to this original experience. How to research historical trauma of Holodomor and how to detect these trauma markers? I use narrative analysis simply because it is a very useful instrument, and it can be used in individual drama when we deal with testimonies, with collective drama and cultural drama, because we can analyze different narratives. But I'm interested more not so in content of this traumatic memory, but in markers. That is, I'm looking for some markers in these narratives. I have analyzed the three narratives. First from them is the memoir of Dmitri Shostakovich. It is like an encyclopedia of Holodomor. And in these narratives, I picked up several these markers. First of all, he told stories about encounters with some girls, presumably the same age of starving little girls. And they have beautiful pale face and blue eyes. They wear rags. They are beggars. He wrote about depths of suffering and cry for help. And it is quotation, the hunger is too painful. Why nobody want to kill us? And he stressed the contrast between indifferent perpetrators and bystanders and starving but compassionate victims. He called children of Holodomor as the most miserable among the most miserable. Next narrative is Victor Kochenko book's I Choose Freedom. It is a well-known book, and he told story of little girl Katya. As well, she is in rags. She begged for bread. She has child's pitiful eyes and shriveled feature. And one relative of Victor took this girl at their house and couldn't bear the thoughts of barefoot, half-naked bit of humanity out of the cold on a night. He told about some kind of prematurely old face, but generally the features of that girl were good, even handsome. She had large blue eyes, and at first this girl was very silent and didn't want to speak about anything, but suddenly when was in very good circumstances and in some intimacy situation, they started to speak, and in this desire of speaking, she was unstoppable. And this girl lost all parents during collectivization and Holodomor. And third narration is a testimony labeled LH1 in the collection of oral history project of the Commission of the Ukrainian Famine. And this is a short story told by another witness, older woman, and this is a story about a little girl which denounced her mother to the police because she realized that her own mother was cannibal. And later, that older women who were witnessing to interviewer rhetorically asked if she remembers this experience or not, or she simply became ordinary Soviet citizen. And it is first part of my research approaches in order to generate some outcome. We should keep in mind the general feature, the general characteristic of Holodomor and Holodomor trauma. And first of all, it is a process of transmitting memory from re-experiencing, that is in terms of PTSD, intrusive, upsetting memories of the event in the period of starvation, to the numbing, that is loss of interest in activities and life in general at the last stages of hunger. And this goal from all this narration, there's something in between with these two general stages of hunger and two general stages of historical drama of Holodomor. And I think that these three girls could have looked like girl on this picture. It is the only picture that we have now from the time depicted girl of 10 years like this. And this photo was taken Austrian engineer Wienerberger in Kharkiv in 1933. Second stage of research, it is create collective image of suffering children. And what we can say about this collective image of suffering children? They're conscious that it is not in state of apathy yet. They're depressed, frightened, and non-assertive. They don't have any courage or desire for revenge, for example, and they're ready to show obedience to anyone who could provide them with means of livelihood. They don't feel guilt, at least on this stage of acute hunger or shame. They're helpless and speechless in ordinary circumstances, that they have a strong longing to tell own story when they find ourselves in very good situation. And presumably they're preoccupied by death imprints because they were unable to mourn their relatives. This imprint, it is term which means that people who survived such great traumas and didn't mourn their relatives have some association to these deceased people, and they cannot avoid this feeling. They repeat them and repeat them again and again. And third stage of my research, it is associated with the so-called mental representation, or we can call them embodied memories of Holodomor. And this term is taken from work of Dutch psychologist Bessel van der Kolk. He wrote that after trauma, when someone experienced acute experience of trauma, this memory of trauma goes not to the reservoir of brain which is connected to verbalized memory, but which is connected to sensomotoric memories. And it is because for someone it is so difficult to testimony, and it is because this traumatic testimony is so distorted and not logical. And the general idea is that mental representation, it is what makes traumatic memory different from non-traumatic one. And it is always connects to such a subject as space, as time, and as movement. That is, in terms of such approach, mental representation of Holodomor always will be connected to silence, to slow motion of time and empty space. It is impossible to imagine, for example, a movie about Holodomor with rush, with loud sounds, with crowds of people. If it will be, it means some kind of rupture in memory, and it's this live experience. And what does it tell us? Why we need such analysis before we go into, for example, to analysis of cultural phenomenon or discourse or something connected to commemorative practices? Was very important for me, first of all, to prepare to interview with author of status and some passers-by at Holodomor Museum in order to understand if they follow this, my understanding of this original experience of Holodomor, this original memory of Holodomor. And if we look at these questions, they have something in common with my analysis before. For example, first question, many children during Holodomor were beggars. Did you think about it? Second question about eyes. What is the most remarkable feature of this statue? Next question about face of starving children, because they often have looked like in old people. It is some characteristic of every people who has experience of hunger and starving. Next question about if this girl want to tell anything, and if she tells it to perpetrators, to bystanders or descendants, for example. If she is silent or she want to tell us something, is she quiet, upset, or numb? For example, if she obedient or if she want to tell and revenge, if the girl's spirit is broken. And for me it is important because this approach focuses on some experience which was before actual creation of some piece of art. That is, we cannot only start our research from this moment. We should look before and look at this, in this case, traumatic memories. And secondly, it means to me that this approach is much more focused on markers but not in content. And it seems to me a very interesting point of view, because I think we're too preoccupied with content of memories, but maybe we should look for not content but markers, and to see if what was going on with these markers after trauma. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the perfect timing. Our second speaker is Andrei Nacu, who is a Romanian visual artist based in London and Iași. In his creative practice, he's using documentary photography, the family album, and archive photos to create stories which analyze the junction between personal memory and social history. In 2013, Andrei was graduated with an MA in documentary photography from the University of Wales, and has previously studied photography and video at the Ogiienko University of Arts in Iași. His projects have been presented in exhibitions such as Events with No Cause, Renaissance, in Getty Images Gallery, Uncertain States, Ghanzi Photography Festival, Fresh Faced, Edges, West Photos Photography Prize, and himself in 2015 he won the Renaissance Photography Prize and was nominated for the Magnum Graduate Photographers Award and shortlisted for the Bar 2 Photobook Prize. So the floor is yours. I don't know if you want to, speak from here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Joanna.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Joanna. First of all, I want to let you know that my background is not so much in academic research, but rather in visual arts and specifically in documentary photography. And I want to start this presentation by showing you a short video about a project I worked on between 2008 and 2013. This is a story about my parents. Through this project, I became interested in working with and analyzing family photographs. After that, I'll talk a bit about the specific context of the family album in communist Romania, and then I'll present you some of my work in progress in relation to this topic. This project, In the Forsaken Garden, Time is a Thief, which I've also made as a photo book, is examining my parents' struggle to absorb and cope with some of the traumatic political and social shifts of the last 50 years. Their relationship becomes an analogy for the disillusionment and dissatisfaction that marked these decades. The challenge... Sorry, yeah. The challenge was to tell that story that is simultaneously personal but also general in relation with the social and political context. So just to show you a few minutes of this video. I don't know if...
Cu timpul însă, am descoperit importanța acestui proces pentru a înțelege cine sunt ei, dar și cine sunt eu și de unde vin. Mai mult, mi-am dat seama de valoarea pe care timpul o dă unei fotografii, așa că am încercat să le documentez existența într-un fel mai responsabil și mai tandru, gândindu-mă la cum îmi vor influența aceste fotografii, experiențele și amintirile. Albumul de familie poate influența cum ne privim trecutul, însă ce facem cu fotografiile, cum le folosim și cum ne raportăm la ele, ține de prezent. Aceste dovezi ale existenței noastre sunt parte a unui proces continuu de creare, recreare și înțelegere a ceea ce suntem noi acum. Părinții mei s-au născut în 1948, la un an după ce comuniștii au declarat România o republică socialistă, cu Gheorghe Udăj la conducerea Partidului Comunist și a statului. Printr-un proces științific și metodic, regimul comunist a urmărit să construiască o lume nouă și un om nou, intervenind până la nivelul celular al societății. Ai mei erau în liceu în 1965, când Ceaușescu a preluat puterea. După o perioadă mai relaxată în ce privește accesul la educația înaltă, la facultăți precum drept, istorie sau filosofie, a redevenit obligatoriu ca profesorii să fie membri de partid și studenții membri ai tineretului comunist. Pe atunci, în 1974, tatăl meu absolvise deja filosofia și, după stagiul militar obligatoriu de 6 luni, și-a început cariera de o viață de profesor. Mama, născută și crescută într-un sătuc, își dorea și ea ce își doreau majoritatea tinerilor vremii, să se mute într-un oraș mare. După câțiva ani în care a lucrat ca învățătoare la țară, mama s-a decis să facă marele pas. În 1976 și-a încheiat studiile în desen tehnic și s-a angajat la un institut de cercetare și proiectare din Iași. După scurt timp l-a cunoscut pe tata. În 1981 s-au căsătorit și s-au mutat într-un apartament dintr-un bloc nou construit. Primul lor copil, sora mea, s-a născut în 1982. Încă din 1966, regimul a interzis avortul printr-un decret menit să crească rata natalității și populația țării, decizie ce a ruinat multe vieți timp de peste 20 de ani. Mama mi-a povestit despre această parte a istoriei, spunându-mi că era o problemă foarte serioasă. Nu existau contraceptive și, din cauza asta, apăreau și tensiuni în cuplu în viața de zi cu zi. Deși părinții mei nu plănuiau să mai aibă un copil, s-a întâmplat ca mama să rămână din nou însărcinată și așa am apărut eu. În 1989, odată ce și-au câștigat libertatea, românii au crezut că totul s-a rezolvat. Dar visurile și speranțele lor că totul se va schimba radical spre bine au fost înșelate de anii de tranziție nesfârșită și de absența atâtor schimbări necesare. După ce și-au trăit mare parte din viață în regimul comunist și după mai bine de 20 de ani de la Revoluție, părinții mei trăiesc într-o așa numită democrație capitalistă, la care, într-o anumită măsură, nu se pot adapta. Ideea de la care am pornit a fost să documentez soarta unei generații, într-un fel, irosite. O experiență colectivă a eșecului. Mulți dintre acești oameni se raportează la ideea unui trai mai bun ca la ceva ce nu poate fi atins în timpul vieții lor. Mă uit la generația părinților mei ca la o victimă a circumstanțelor istorice. Povestea conține o tensiune între trecut și prezent și se plasează la intersecția dintre memoria personală și istoria socială, cercetând încercarea familiei mele de a se adapta la niște schimbări traumatizante ce definesc România contemporană. Începutul narațiunii este abrupt. Cu sticletele din copilăria tatălui meu ce cade victima a timpului hoț, pentru ca apoi copilul de atunci să pornească la drum lăsând în urmă această grădină. Firul epic este subtil și nu urmează o cronologie. Intercalând imagini de acum și fotografii din arhiva familiei, ghidez privitorul într-o incursiune ce îl pune în postura de martor al unor momente aparent neimportante, dar care, însumate, compun o confesiune intimă.
Yeah, so just a glimpse of that project. Yeah, so based on the experience gained while working on this project, I began collecting family photographs. Alongside digitizing the family albums of my acquaintances, I began acquiring photographs from flea markets and antique shops. I have created, the archive created contains now more than 30,000 images. This work is still in progress so far, and it's mainly constructed as an artistic project, but my intention is to take it forward and expand it as a PhD practice-based research. So my research question would be, what is the relation between the visual auto-representation of the family of the Romanian family during communism and the process of reevaluation of the past, using the created archive and trying to investigate and analyze the specificity and the limitation of the family album in communist Romania, what significance the particular convention found in these photographs would have, and the relation between this type of representation of family history and the memory of the recent past. Looking at the context in which these photos were created and at the way the communist past was dealt with so far, we can identify a few relevant aspects. Even though photography was quite popular in Romania in the 70s and 80s, there is a lack of straightforward images documenting Romanian communism. One of the reasons for this could be that the regime succeeded in a process of taming photography by framing it as a purely amateurish endeavor. So, with very little exception, visual representation of the daily life, or at least hints about it, can mainly be found in the family albums. The way in which the memory of the communist past is or should be managed or reevaluated, it's still a very relevant topic. After 1989, post-communist Romania was defined for more than a decade by the so-called politics of amnesia, in an attempt to silence the past and adopt a forgive and forget strategy. This was followed by a more confrontational approach in which the communist past was both politically criminalized and symbolically demonized. The public discourse now, it's still very much in line with an anti-communist agenda, leaving almost no space to an objective analysis and debate or nuanced opinions. Kelcha and Druță discuss how the concept of post-socialism is no longer used efficiently and suggests that particular attention should be paid to the way in which, quote, economic and political elites in Central and Eastern Europe continue to use the ghost of state socialism as the ultimate boogeyman, disciplinary device, and ideological antioxidant, end quote. They call this blend of post-1989 anti-communism and neoliberal hegemony zombie socialism, and argue that is a key component of contemporary capitalism in Central and Eastern Europe. However, looking at several surveys done by the Institute for the Investigation of Communist Crimes and the Memory of Romanian Exile, that investigated the perspective of the communist nostalgia, one can learn that the perception of the population regarding the communist past is rather positive in comparison to the present status quo. In this given context, the so much needed process of coming to terms with the past became trapped in a rigid dichotomy, making things very hard to tackle. I agree with Rusu that what we need is, quote, a multi-layered, comprehensive memory accommodating within itself the essential tension between the memory of the terror and the nostalgic memory of the not-so-bad sides of communism, end of quote. I think that one of the things that can contribute to this process is to better integrate the daily life in the analysis of the communist period. In order to address the primary question that I want to undertake answering, I have realized that first I need to analyze whether there were any particular conventions or patterns in family photography in communist Romania. And if so, what significance would the specificities of the family album have? I'm analyzing the archive of family images by systematizing, using a taxonomical classification system, identifying patterns, motifs, specificities, and exploring it using the grounded theory, an inductive approach which involves the process of systematic generation of concepts and theories based on the collected data. The process of systematization and classification of these images is a laborious one and dependent on the influx of photographs to the archive. As the number of photographs rises, it becomes easier to identify categories and elements or situations that are recurrent or that could be relevant to my research. Most of the times, the original reason for putting together a series is an unusual element. that grabs my attention and makes me wonder. The similarity becomes the criteria by which the photographs are added to the series. Yet, it is not the resemblance between these photographs that garners interest in long run. Each and every photograph may depict the same object, characters, or situations, but this is not the main point of interest. After the initial surprise, when we discover that the photograph, though it might be singular, is not unique, but rather part of a family of images, all sharing the same subject, it is in fact the differences that are intriguing and capture the attention. As expected, analyzing these images confirmed the fact that the typical Romanian family album is built upon the same general principles. But besides the usual photographs from weddings, holidays, and other happy life events, one exception that I found are funeral photographs, which seems to have been quite a common practice during this period. Photographing a deceased person, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, was not something unusual, and sometimes these photographs were the only ones ever taken of their subject. Maybe it was the same situation for some of the photos I collected, especially for the ones taken in the countryside. However, photography was quite popular and affordable, so I think it was a matter of custom more than anything else. It seems that this kind of photographs were very common and played a part in the mourning and memorialization process. They were displayed by the family in their homes, placed in the photo albums, and copies were sent to friends and relatives. There are certain elements and details that can transcend the initial purpose for which one image was captured and can gain a different meaning when analyzed in the present context. Here are just some of the recurrent themes that I have identified so far. Moș Gerilă, Grandfather Frost, the Romanian communist version of Santa Claus, people speaking on the telephone or posing as if they are doing so, the red ball with white dots, posing with taxidermied animals, and especially with stuffed bears, Ceausescu's portrait, etc. For the purpose of this presentation, I want to discuss in more detail just one of these examples and my artistic approach to it. I have come across this red ball with white dots in many family albums. When in front of the camera, it seems that the ball was becoming more than a simple toy and was used as a prop in order to construct an image worth being captured. It seems that no matter the place, whether it was the seaside or the mountains, summer or winter, inside the house, out for a picnic, or in the photo studio, posing with the ball was popular amongst kids and adults alike. The ball features in pictures taking over a few decades. Depending on each context, we can observe activities, clothes, interiors, objects, etc. that were used at that time, all of these being small clues about daily life. Looking at the best solution to create a coherent sequence, one that holds the viewer's attention in a playful and surprising way, I have created this photobook dummy. I have it here. I've been inspired by how the cutting out or revealing of things were used in interactive books for children. With this in mind, I choose to create cutouts resembling windows, through which the viewer can initially see nothing but the ball, and only afterwards, when turning the page, discovering the full image. In this way, the context in which the ball is found becomes the key element. The ball itself functions as a pretext, which forces us to analyze more carefully all these apparently banal scenes. However, when seen together, these scenes can speak in a more subtle way about the daily life from that period. I have also added to the book some memories about this ball from the people in the photographs. Here are some examples. Quote, I remember the red ball with white dots. I recall the photographer asked me to pose 1,000 times before taking the shot. She kept changing the position of my head, sticking my face to the ball. My neck was so twisted that many years after, when I was older, I was wondering how come it's not visible in the picture, how unnatural and painful this position was. And I could not understand why I had to pose with the ball like this. Was she photographing me or the ball? One other way in which I have exhibited this series was by transforming the staircase of 3 blocks of flats in an unconventional gallery space. With this strategy, the photographs are symbolically brought back in this environment situated at the border between public and private space, and which defines the communist way of living. As a next step, I want to go back to the families from this block of flats and elicit stories and memories of the past about daily life in that period. Also, I want to explore the transmission of these memories within the family and find out if having the photos displayed in their living space had any impact. The most important result of all this process of systematization and classification of images, through recognizing categories, motifs, and situations or objects that are recurrent, have been precisely identifying possible symbols. These symbols, when put in context of series with similar images, can speak about the specificities of the Romanian family album and at the same time about certain particularities in that period. Further question would be, how do these photographs and the family album created from them influence our memories and the way in which the past is perceived in the present? Or how are these memories transmitted within a family? How do young people nowadays relate to their inherited family history that is depicted in the family album, but which they were for the most part unable to witness? Creating this series as a way of analyzing the family album and its relation with the collective memory about the socialist Romania could play an important role in the process of re-evaluation of the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and again, thank you for the perfect timing. Our next speaker is Filip Lipiński, who is assistant professor at the Department of Art History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland. His professional interests concern film and photography and methodology of art history. He was a Fulbright Fellow at City University of New York, a recipient of Terra Foundation for American Art Summer Residency in France, and Terra Travel Grant in the United States. He's the author of numerous publications, including the book on the virtual hopper, Images in a Remembering Look. And now it's
okay. Oops. Thank you for the introduction. And at the beginning, I will say that this paper originated as this presentation originated as a paper for a symposium that was organized last year by Polin Museum of Polish Jews in Warsaw during Frank Stella's exhibition. And this is a largely modified and rewritten in English version of this text. Frank Stella's series of works titled Polish Villages, executed between 1971 and 1974, marks a special stage of his career when he diverted from his monochromatic striped and later polygonal multicolored paintings. The new project surprised numerous critics. It involved radical change of formal structure, diversification of material medium, and the way the paintings or other architectural objects, collages or reliefs, as they were called, were constructed. Despite Stella's statements asserting his interest in construction and complete control over the process, and I quote him, "The Polish pictures were well designed and very tight in terms of engineering," end of quote, it was definitely no longer a modernist analysis of immanent, purely pictorial or physical conditions of art and its materials. Rather, regardless of the author's intentions, I propose to see Polish villages as an experiment in figuration of the complex construction and work of remembering, an analog to stratified and fragmentary structure of cultural, both collective and individual memory. Let me recap the so-called basic facts. Polish Villages series consists of more than 130 predominantly large-scale acrylic, hard-edged painted collages and constructions of mixed media, preceded by more than 40 drawings executed in 1970. The main body of the project can be divided into 43 groups of works, each with a main large format piece as its focal point, executed in a few versions, bearing the name of a Polish village where a wooden synagogue was built. Each main work was additionally accompanied by a constellation of sketches, maquettes, preparatory models, and smaller versions. The immediate pretext for this immense body of work were photographs and architectural drawings of wooden synagogues in the pre-World War II Poland, and sometimes even earlier photos, reproduced in an English edition of 1959 Maria and Kazimierz Piechotka's book. He was presented by the architect Richard Mayer. A starting point for this publication were the interwar period photographs. Here we see a few photographs below. Photographs by a Polish art historian Szymon Zajczyk and other often unnamed photographers surveying the then still existing Jewish wooden architecture on Polish territories. This documentation was commissioned as material for research carried out in the so-called Jewish art study at the Department of Polish Architecture run by Professor Oskar Sosnowski at Warsaw Technical School, so-called Polytechnic. All of the photographed, inventoried, and analyzed buildings were destroyed, mostly during the Second World War, as a result of military activities and consistent Nazi policy against Jews and their cultural heritage. Similarly, at that time, a significant part of the archive, including negatives and academic work on the synagogues, perished or went missing. The remaining materials were a basis for the book that reached Stella. As a result, we deal with a complex sequence of mediations or strata of different kind, laying ground for Polish Villages project. The actual places of cult, standing for different histories of communities they gathered, their photographic representation, architectural drawings, archival elaboration, followed by dissemination of the archive and simultaneous destruction of its reference, reassembling the remaining materials into form of a book, at the end of which we find Stella's cycle, or series. The supposed beginning of this complicated sequence, the possible original referent, cannot be unequivocally specified, as it may be because it may be merely the architecture, but also what the architecture stands for, the Jewish culture and its history, encompassing both the past as I will show later on the future. As I mentioned earlier, Stella himself emphasized his predominantly formal interest in architectural elements of these wooden constructions and described his work as a variation on these forms and forms that determined the nature of his procedure. For Stella, Polish Villages was a way to, as he put it, start all over again, because he did not know how to improve or move forward with what he had been doing to that point. Commenting on the project, the artist said, and I quote him, "Struggling through the Polish pictures opened things up for me, so that I was able to use my gift for structure with something that modernism hadn't really exploited before, the idea that paintings could be constructed, made by picture building. Building a picture was something natural for me. Build it and then paint it. It was a job I was well suited for," end of quote. The characteristic of Polish villages as a whole is most of all diversification of materials. A good example here is a group of Bogoria that I showed a moment ago. I will show it again. In different phases of work, he used varied materials such as paper, Bristol, and corrugated board, plywood, wood, painted or natural, felt, or even aluminium. While preparatory works are usually materially homogeneous, the material structure of the main paintings is much more diverse. There are collages of elements and forms whose physical provenance, due to their use of color, often seemed unclear. In contrast to Stella's classical works, Polish villages, geometrical as they were, their forms were much more varied, less orderly, and unsymmetrical. More importantly, the combination of collage and relief, spatial arrangement of incorporated elements, adding haptic, textural experience to the reception of the work, generated an impression of overlapping, interconnected, and sometimes ruptured and continued in another place layers, like in Olkieniki 3 from 1972. As a result, Stella did away with the so praised by minimalists material purity and fetishized by modernist critics medium specificity, opticality, and pictorial flatness in favor of what Andrei Turovsky described as, I quote, the structure of superimposed color planes, end of quote, structure that was much less modular, predictable, less formulaic or regulated, untamed, if you will, and in consequence, despite its hard-edged quality, more difficult to classify, describe, and interpret within the modernist paradigm. Moreover, Mark Godfrey noticed that one does not view Polish villages frontally. The textural and spatial complexity, a series of formal dislocations, displaces a stable modernist subject of the gaze to make room for, I quote, a subject in crisis, unable to experience a clear sense of presence before the work, unable to know its limits and unsure of their own position in turn, end of quote. This, one could say, anamorphic dislocation made it impossible to experience the grace of presentness in front of a picture, obscured and destabilized not only the subject, but also the object and its material status. Interestingly, Godfrey noticed that complicated or even chaotic structure of final works manifests the process of the creation, hence concentrating viewers' attention on the work itself and blocking external references. But this either-or logic seems flawed because it excludes the possibility of concentrating on the work and seeing its formal solutions as signifiers or symptoms of what I would not describe as external references. Rather, I would say that we deal with virtual layers of images and discourses which seem to have underlain, informed, and affected the ultimate shape of Stella's material objects, thus becoming an indirect and immaterial but effective and active element of the resulting work. But this expanded virtual referential field which coagulated in these constructions becomes a part of our contemporary experience and is still expanding due to cultural mediation and dissemination of memory. As a result, Polish villages are inherently anachronistic. Their overwhelming physical presence, first internally fractured on the level of materially differential versions, virtually extends towards the past, gathers layers of its texts of different mediated memories, and brings them back to contemporary viewers. The issue of memory with reference to the body of work until recently was either overlooked or treated very generally. That was certainly because of interpretive frame imposed by Stella, who minimized his attachment to any aspect of the project unrelated to formal considerations. Authors of more recent texts, even if they discuss the question of memory, they seem to take it for granted and do not theorize on how memory translates into formal solutions, how it is signified. The aspect of memory was taken up more extensively by Clifford Channing, who wrote that it's difficult to describe Polish villages as a memorial, but they definitely constitute a reminder of traumatic history. They are the art of afterward. Karol Solus noted that along with the problems of construction and what the artist called interlockingness of architectural wooden elements that was of particular interest to him, the series, I quote, can function as a symbolic reminder of the culture of Eastern European shtetl, and it has been interpreted as serving as a metaphor for Stella's empathy for the lives once flourishing in those buildings in pre-World War II Poland, end of quote. However, the above comments neither give us much clue to any principle underlying what Piotr Jamski called the miracle of memory, nor how this is connected with the actual objects, the process of construction with, as Stella put it, building a painting, or how they trigger remembrance today. I've already mentioned a number of historical and visual pretexts for Stella's final work. Discussing Polish villages is mostly in mostly formal artistic or architectural terms was indeed prefigured in the archival impulse of the Piechotka's book, concentrating on the architectural form and preserving knowledge about it. This, however, implicates an omission which thus appears even more telling. The bracketing of historical events and layers of memory virtually located in between these images that haunt and saturate Polish villages with special meaning and seem to inform their structure. As for the deceiving search for similarities, the mimetic motivation for connecting a photograph of a synagogue to a specific work, let alone the general principle of interlocking parts and predominant angularity, indeed, in Stella's paintings one can notice several actual analogies to architectural elements of synagogues. And here's another one, or especially what I mean is this triangular element in the shadow in the photograph, and this yellow part in the middle of Stella's work. Bogoria or Odels can serve as good examples. However, rather than being an evidence of superficial mimetic resemblance, I see them, these elements, as residue of the work through material memory trace figures which activate a dialectic of a distant and feeble connection in time and space on the one hand, and the irreversible displacement, loss and absence on the other, thus indirectly signifying the historical vicissitudes of the synagogues and what they stood for. Stella worked on material that was a few times removed, leading back to the lost communities, already visible in the photographs, mostly emptied of any human presence, as if prefiguring the Nazi final solution. These photographs and the reference, this is one of the, not this actual photograph was represented in the book, but a very similar ones were in the introduction. Other photographs were mainly architectural, more focused on the formal elements. These photographs and the reference, the buildings with their histories, situate the beginning of Polish Villages project long before it was actually started. I believe that the subject in crisis mentioned by Godfrey, the unstable position and dislocation of an observer, can also describe the virtual position of the artist who, regardless of any intentions and statements, finds himself in front of an archive of images which preserve the look of something that was there but would have been destroyed, and something which, from Stella's standpoint, had already been gone, long gone. An experience of the future anterior, not just in terms of material destruction of architecture, but the loss of Jewish culture and human lives. What comes to mind here is Roland Barthes' commentary on Alexander Gardner's 19th century photograph of a young convict, Louis Payne. He noticed the punctum external to the image itself but affecting it, which is the imminent and unavoidable death of the man, something bound to happen, and what already belonged to the past. As a result, these photographs shock with the paradoxical combination of stability, craftsmanship, and the reference and the never represented, located in the intervals between images, fragility, and ultimate erasure of their objects. They activate the work of remembering their destruction and tragic history behind it, a ruin always already inscribed in a photographic medium. Stella's collage-like and layered structures can be read as literal images of something somewhat structured debris. But again, this facile parallel opens up another level. These irregular constructions, or rather deconstructions, appear to be a result of interpretation and mediation of memory. Not so much do they make us remember the look of synagogues, but act as pictorial or architectural analogy of their complex history seen from our contemporary viewpoint to become, as one critic put it, the architecture of memory. I would say Polish villages, their creation and reception, is a classic example of vicarious mnemonic experience famously described by Marian Hirsch as post-memory, a mediated memory of something that could not have been possibly experienced. As Dominic Lecapra wrote on a similar issue, I quote him, "The experience of trauma may be vicarious or virtual, that is undergone in a secondary fashion by one who was not there or did not go through the traumatizing events themselves," end of quote. This type of traumatic mediated memory is paradoxical because its formal realizations or concretizations reveal the conditions of unavoidable failure to remember, the work of memory rather than actual remembrance. Stella seemed to have framed or shielded this vicariously experienced past in his present in a way he was the most familiar with, solving the issues of construction, medium, and materiality. At the same time, the result of his process, over which he allegedly was in total control, are works which look as if memory of the unrepresented, but implicated in the photographed traumatic events, burst the formal seams of Stella's earlier striped or polygonal works, resulting in a paradoxical constructed ruin of Polish villages. Another but strictly connected perspective that sheds light on Polish villages as stratified figurations of memory is the perceptual experience on the part of the viewer, who virtually peels the actual physical work off its layers in a process of differential projection. In fact, the arrangement of the exhibition in Polin Museum in Warsaw last year was also an occasion to see that while these physically overwhelming, impressive structures could possibly be discussed in terms of formal solutions, they were much more persuasive and saturated with signification when one actually let the discourse of memory materialized in photographs, drawings, and other documentation play a part in the act of perception and interpretive reading. The complementary connection between the act of perception of specific objects and images, memories or associations that are thereby activated has been discussed by diverse thinkers and scholars. I do not have time to summarize this extensive problem here, but let me just point to, and I'm happy that Professor Mikebal mentioned this author, point to Henri Bergson's idea that, and I quote Bergson, "There is no perception which is not full of memories. With the immediate and present data of our senses, we mingle 1,000 details out of our past experience," end of quote. At the same time, memories, belonging in his view to the domain of the virtual, affect and transform perceptual data. As a result, and I quote Bergson again, "Perception is never a mere contact of the mind with the object present. It is impregnated with memory images which complete it as they interpret it," end of quote. Much more recently, from anthropological perspective, the connection of memory, images, and media was emphasized by Hans Belting. Images, being carriers of memory, undergo intense technological remediation and dissemination. Complicating a distinction between individual and collective memory, they open previously inaccessible spatial and temporal dimensions and allow us to face, I quote Belting, it happens all the time. Okay, I'll take advantage. To face pictorial presence of absent places, which we, and I quote again Belting, "we do not visit physically, but they come to us in images," end of quote. Belting says that we internalize and mix individual and collective images, which we appropriate as our own to become vicarious memories. We use first and second-hand images of lost places infused in varied temporal dimensions to defend ourselves from the loss of space and the absolute passing of time. In consequence, a differential act of metamorphosis is taking place from the seen to the remembered, from disembodied external images we absorb to their subsequent re-embodiment, a concretization of which, among other things, happen to be works of art. In the meantime, our psychological apparatus transforms fragments, displaces, or hides this material, depending on our affective investment in it and other factors. As a result, we could generally say that our perception is always already, and I quote, "a remembering productive look," to borrow a term from Kaja Silverman, also mentioned by Professor Mikebal today. In narratives about art, we art or cultural historians we can acknowledge that this look, infused with memory, is our own, or if necessarily consisting of, borrowed material, or we can put it ourselves in a more comfortable and less responsible position and virtually assign it to an author of the object. Actually, both ways on different levels work for Stella's Polish villages and are not mutually exclusive. In this necessarily abbreviated account, I did not claim to know what Stella thought when he was working on Polish villages. Instead, I retrospectively projected the possible scenario of impulses governing such an unexpected shift in his art. More importantly, though, I tried to describe and theorize my own and possibly other contemporary viewers' experience of these works as images shaped and hence figuring the work of shaped by and hence figuring the work of vicarious memory. As a result, Stella's famous dictum, "What you see is what you see," does not hold water here. The constructivist minimalist reification of a work of art has been annulled for the sake of temporalized, stratified construction containing much more than what is physically given. Or put differently, the visual and material qualities of Stella's works activate an inseparable process of seeing and remembering, perception saturated with memory of photographs of synagogues and history they implicate. Polish villages demand such an virtually extended field of vision where what you see is what you see, but only when you accept the layered, ontologically varied structure of visuality, neutralizing the distance between the past and the present, the virtual and the material. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Professor Florin Abraham, who is a senior researcher at the National Institute for the Study of Totalitarianism of the Romanian Academy and professor at the College of Communication at the National University for Political Studies and Public Administration in Bucharest. He's a member of the Collegium of the National Council for the Study of the Securitate Archives and the Romanian member of the board of the European Network of Remembrance and Solidarity. He is the author of many books, of which the most recent is Romania since the Second World War, a political, social and economic history. And he's going to speak on historiography and memory in post-truth era towards a European public sphere, some theoretical consideration.
Thank you very much. I have here many pages, but don't be worried. If I look at your mood, I know that your short memory is almost full. So I know that almost everybody, excepting me, of course, are waiting to go to the longer break. So I am not intend to give my full paper, just a short part of it, of course. If we're looking at the title, look very complicated and sometimes ambiguous. Yes, but in fact, it's about us. It's about our time and probably our future. So at the beginning, I will try to deliver some clarification about the concepts. So it's almost a commonplace that European Union, us, we are in crisis, in different crises. And from this respect, I am looking at the narrow question, relation between identity and memory on the time, on our time, when our societies are dominated by so-called web social media. So my aim is to understand the influence of the historiography in the process of creating a so-called European public sphere in the context of the Web 0.20 tools, means Facebook. Many of you are using in the time that I spoken, probably. And my point will be to discuss the project of House of European History as a paradigmatic example of what is called transnational history in order to create a new historical memory for the European people. Okay. We could pass. So, for the beginning, we need to clarify some concept. No. Some concept. Post-truth, it was a very in fashion terms, and of course is not precisely enough. But it was defined as a Word of the Year 2016 by Oxford Dictionary, and it's strongly related with the other concept, post-truth politics. And post-truth politics, it's also connected with a very important political event. In fact, the Brexit, the referendum for Brexit, and the American election, where, as everybody knows, Mr. Trump are winning. So, in a sense, the post-truth politics refers to, first, systematic use of information that are not related in any way to the reality, so-called fake news. Second aspect is domination of emotional motivation over rational political choices. And the third point, it's about turning fake information in the dominant political themes. Many historians are here, and maybe you'll tell me these are characteristics of the totalitarian state. It's true. But what is new is that these phenomena are present in the democratic societies. And the important factor is that it's propagated and created through social media instruments. And one of the major changes delivered or brought by the social media is that we don't have the tools to establish the truth. Because on the traditional media are laws or the ontological codes in order to establish the truth. In social media, it was an affair just between us. But it's very important on the changing the political situation. The second factor is so-called the systematic erosion of the position occupied in society by so-called experts, intellectual professionals. Because one opinion of the Nobel laureate could have the same value as almost illiteracy men in the social media. And the other fact important, it was that the truth almost is established not as a value or correspondences between affairs, correspondence with the reality, but it depends very much about his popularity of the news. So this is a problem. We need also to question if the discussion about the fake news isn't itself a fake. My short answer is not a fake, but could take very serious in account that it became more and more a question debated in our societies. So, we are coming to our subject, the relation between European public sphere, historical memory, and historiography. To be very short on this question, the discussion about the European public sphere are very connected, in fact, with three options regarding the European future or European organization. Now, intergovernmental framework, it's legitimized by the capacity of solving problems, and the supranational European, organized by the federal method, it needs to be a community of values. And also the third options are regarding so-called post-national democracy, a new polity where the national states are almost missing. So for the supranational and post-national aims of or project, the question of the memory is strategic, because the idea was to create a new mythology, a new identity, in order to have the stability and to create the legitimacy of the new model of organization. I didn't know too much on the different theoretical model of the of the public sphere, European public sphere. I will go directly to the so-called European House of European History. Was launched in the 7th of May this year, and it was the most visible initiative in order to create a so-called pan-European historical memory, in order to have a new European identity. Two premises are at the basis of achieving this project. First, that assuming the constructivist theories concerning the forming of nation, whose main exponent became Benedict Anderson, that nation are a social construction, not have an ontological basis. And the second is that the European dream will continue and will become strong enough to have more and more followers. It's very easy to understand what are the aim of the House of European History, looking for the conceptual basis of House of European History, finalized in 2008, provided by the historian. I didn't go too much on this. But also I didn't know to present itself what it is, how it is House of European History, their content, their historical content. I deliver just a few critiques of this project. First is that House is rejected because it would not have a scientific basis, and it's just a so-called ideological manipulation of the past in order to offer a mythological support to the European Union. Other critic is that synthesize the anti-historical tendencies on minimizing the role of the past in forming social society in order to not give an enough role of the past, of the 19th century, 18th century, and other past. Also, it's critique by reflect so-called political correctness in the European Union. For example, in the house in the museum was reflected very negative effects of the colonialism, but said critics are not recognized the role on the modernization role that have the empires on the different space. I will go directly to the end, and my conclusion is that the relation between science means also historiography and collective memory, is in the phase of redefinition as a result of the social changes generated by the rise of the social media. The relation between historiography and historical memory conveyed in past through the education system and media are also becoming incoherent as a result of relativist right axiological models within contemporary societies. True, from the perspective of its use in the society, is undermined not only by the fake news, which send information without correspondence in reality, but also by the deep decay of the mechanism which set information into motion without involving legal and legal liability. So the question is, what time is necessary to achieve a new historical memory? The question is essential, and studies about formation of modern states emphasize that achieving a new historical conscience are needed a minimum 100 years, so 3 generations. And the project of establishing a new mythology, having at its center the cosmopolitan and democratic European, who has accomplished the European dream, it's only during a first phase on application and its conclusion about the failure of success are premature. The second question, if we have other similar projects, and to not be scandalized, so similar but not identical, it was the project of Homo Sovieticus, because also was the first and the biggest project to create so-called transnational identity of the people. And the expecting that the nationalists will disappear was wrong, as everybody knows. Other question is, what are the minimal necessary conditions for the success of European history mythification process? And of course, we needed to see what are happening in the past. So, it needed the existence of a broad consensus among political and intellectual elites around their aim. And in fact, the idea of mythologizing Europe past in order to establish a new historical memory is increasingly challenged by those who oppose in transfer of more and more elements of the sovereignty towards European institutions. Also, for the success is needed to have the existence of an idea corpus accepted by a good part of the elite from the member states. Here, historiography plays an essential role, but it must say that it not have an European historiography in the full meaning of the word, but only national historiographies within which currents manifest, which have an objective to accomplish so-called European history. Also, the other condition is needed to socialization tools should work towards creating a Homo Europaeus. But educational system as a main socialization tools not have an established a strategic dimension in order to create a so-called European Homo Europaeus, and is linked in the strategic way with the local and national. Now I finish. The national memory. Also, mass media and social communication tools should ensure support of possible socialization policy for creating a pan-European identity. On the contrary, numerous studies concerning European public sphere media show that European questions are on the second or on the third priority of the mass media. And also, we needed to developing and manifesting a refined and non-conflicting European culture of memory. Altogether, we're trying and we're working on this, but the society, majority of the society, I think, as recent studies show, is not following us. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll hear the commentary by Luiza Nader, who is an art historian, assistant professor in the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw. Her interests are focused on avant-garde and modernism, relation between art and limit events, affect, trauma, memory, the figures of witness and observer exclusively in Central European context. Her current research is dedicated to the theory of seeing, wall drawings, and series of collages by Władysław Strzemiński. So Luiza, you are here. Okay, sorry. Luiza insisted to read, because we have one more presentation, which is a written presentation. Normally we do not read written presentation because you can all read them. But as Tomasz, yeah. Okay, so
we have one written presentation, which is really interesting, and I wish you could have read it already. It's available outside, and it will be available online. And I asked Tomasz Szerszeń, who is an author of this wonderful text, to prepare a kind of summary for us, exclusively for us. So my friend Filip Lipiński will support Tomasz Szerszeń, and he will read the 2 pages summary. And I just would like to introduce Tomasz Szerszeń, who is not here, he's ill. But Tomasz is an anthropologist. He works at the Polish Academy of Science, and he's also a wonderful artist.
All right, so I'll read Tomasz Szerszę's text. My apologies for any mistakes because I just glimpsed at it a moment ago. So, the title of the, and there is no images, Luiza, for this. No. Okay, that's a pity, actually. Anyways, the title is Memory, Photography, History, Post-Soviet Auto-photo-biographies. Memory, Photography, History, Post-Soviet Auto-photo-biographies. Post-Soviet photographic narrations about the last decade of the USSR, perestroika period, political transformation and the 90s are interesting not only as a visual evidence about the, quote, end of the empire, end of quote, but also a philosophical mediation on relation between the memory, photography, and history. The disintegration of the imperialistic Soviet order and the destruction of its vision of history is accompanied by the disintegration of the ways of seeing, the collapse of principles that govern the photographic image. The medium of photography reflects perfectly the formless moment of historical experience. As Hayden White wrote, and this is a larger quote from White, historians always have problems with transitional moments in the histories of the subjects. It is also because a transition is precisely what cannot be represented in any medium, because it is what happens between two states considered to be relatively stable. And this moment cannot be represented because it has the same status as the blank space that divides two frames of a movie film. The movement in which something becomes something else or something other than what it had earlier been cannot be represented through verbal or visual images, because this moment is precisely a moment of the absence of presence, the moment at which one presence is drained of its substance and filled with another. And on any scientific account of this phenomenon, it must be said that such a moment is overdetermined, too full of casual forces, too fraught with miracle to be the subject of an explanation. End of quote. What was interesting for me, not me, Tomasz Szerszeń, and maybe for me as well. What was interesting for me and what I want to stress in my text was a kind of parallel, historiosophic and photographic, consideration on this paradoxical and impossible moment of transition, zero moment of history. I want to focus on the works by Boris Mikhailov and Evgeny Pavlov, two eminent ex-USSR photographers. Both came from Kharkov, today Ukraine. That's a pity that we don't have these images. One of the reasons Mikhailov and Pavlov's photographic narratives from 1980s and 1990s are so powerful is that they are located in an impossible utopian space, a kind of utopia beyond history, a space that condenses the Soviet and post-Soviet experience while distilling it of facts at the expense of affects, attesting to the beginning of the end of an era and then to its actual end, reflecting the collapse of a certain historical order. They themselves produce a kind of visual experience that, like Bataille's formless, deforms our notion of history, investing it with new meanings. Photography is problematized here as something that annihilates the represented reality as a vehicle of death and ultimate disintegration. The affirmation of nothingness means not only that the photographer accepts the collapse of his world, but also that photography accelerates the process. For Mikhailov and Pavlov, lack of home, an ambiguous metaphor but also a concrete reference to social reality, becomes a token of the post-Soviet experience, a permanent condition that also describes the relationship between images and history. A return to that which has been lost, socialism, empire, homogeneous and stable space, is impossible. The sense of nostalgia is rather a connector, making it possible to build a bridge or to mediate between the past and the future, between that which has been realized and that which remained, the past imperfective, between individual and collective, and finally, probably what is most important, between facts and affects. At the same time, unlike the historian, who by definition sides with the latter, the photographer seems, due to the specificity of his medium, to be constantly mediating between facts and affects, reporting on the color of history rather than history itself. Boris Mikhailov photographic series from Yesterday's Sandwich, Superimpositions, this is a title, through Unfinished Dissertation, another title, to 3 cycles from 1990s, and I'm Not I, At Dusk and Case History, as well as Evgeny Pavlov's Home Life book and Total Photography, again titles, can also be understood as a transition from individual to form of collective autobiography, an autobiography that says we and not I. As Deleuze put it, emotions do not speak the I, and that inscribes itself in the zero moment of history, a moment that is so difficult to capture and relate. It is also hard to say, though, whether we are dealing with the here with memory loss or memory revival. Perhaps it is a constant movement, a flow that destroys individual and collective memory in order to revivify it. That's a difficult word. Revivify it. This tension also contains the meaning of the labyrinth as such, a metaphor of simultaneously homelessness and homeless images that appears in Pavlov's Home Life book and Balagra's filmic commentary on it. It is both a home made with photos that gives shelter and a trap that destroys all memories and thus renders any autobiography impossible. That's it.
Thanks so much for Petro.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you very, very much for all your presentations, and they reminded me indeed that to remember we have to imagine. So all of your presentations helped me, at least, to imagine the past, even the impossible past. So I will try to summarize shortly all of your presentations, and then I will make a little commentary, and then I will ask you individually, and then we will collect the questions from the public. I will start with Florin. So Florin Abraham presented a paper on post-truth mechanisms entangled in social media, making an analogy to the study of the conceptual bias of House of European History. And as I understand, Florin, House of European History is an institution, as you claim, which understands its political goals in establishing a pan-European, highly homogenic memory, opposing the national histories, collective and cultural memories. On the other hand, four other presentations focused on limit events or traumatic experiences in Central Eastern Europe and collapsing Soviet Union, Ukraine. All of these experiences and events are highly mediated by artworks, artifacts, and objects in contemporary culture, which underlie both, I can say, the solidarity against suffering, but also the very distinctive differences between societies in the Central Eastern part of Europe. Vitalii Ogiienko reflected on the event of Holodomor embedded in the narrations of secondary witnesses on young women and girls, but also on its transgenerational after effects, which, as I understand, are visible in the contemporary sculpture of the little starving girl from Kiev, which became an icon on this endemic, traumatic, multi-layered experience. Andrei Nacu presented his photographic project on family albums and everydayness in totalitarian and contemporary Romania as a tool of balancing the experience of terror and finding perhaps the more positive sides of living in the communism, but also to negotiate between personal memory and social history. Filip Lipiński analyzed the series of works by Frank Stella, Polish Villages, as a multi-layered memory of both personal and collective loss of the Jewish lives and culture, embodied in the architecture of synagogues, and he uncovered perception as remembering and productive look. And I think he also uncovered memory as a phenomenon that is always on the move, that is traveling, which is flexible, but also somehow homeless. That's the kind of common point with Tomasz Szerszeń. And the last presentation of Tomasz Szerszeń, the author, in his presentation on works of Boris Mikhailov and Yevgeny Pavlov, connected to the perestroika process and the end of Soviet Empire, focused our attention on the transitional moment, the moment of the 0 degree of history, when one type of memory melts down and the other is not yet to come, when memory, history, and contemporaneity becomes formless. These events are far from being worked through and far from being mourned, and excluded for many years due to historical, political, ideological, or subjective constraints. I think they form nuclei of potential suffering, pain, fear, rage, and many other affective phenomena, which still influences our future, our present, and our future. However, in all of these cases, historical trauma could be both the locus of conflict and misrecognition, as well as the site of empathy, mourning, and perhaps mutual understanding. And I wonder, and I think this is the most friendly space for such reflection for all of us, I wonder if we are ready to connect to each other's pain. If we could find a way of mediating, sharing, recognizing, and understanding traumas of other groups than our own local communities, in order to produce forms of memory that quit with competition in suffering, which is often politically instrumentalized. And other reflection I have in mind is that not all limit experiences have to be traumatic. In Central Eastern Europe, the position of the victim of, let's say, totalitarian state sometimes gives too much of comfort to individuals and societies, since the idea of trauma erases the questions of agency, responsibility, and co-responsibility, and the traumatic experiences of, let's say, minority groups are eclipsed again. I wonder if Michael Rothberg's concept of multi-directional memory could be of any help, or perhaps a starting point for us, and that would be my question to all of you. And let me remind you that in the idea of multi-directional memory, the history of the other does not to have to obscure my own past, but they could support each other and mutually serve as screens for multi-directional projections, where the key concept is the key concept of this conference, i.e. solidarity. So here comes my specific questions to each of you. Again, I will start with Florin Abraham. I wonder, Florin, if you have in mind any paradigm of memory that would help us to solve this problem. If there is any kind of modus of memorizing which includes the diversity and very distinctive differences between Eastern Central Europeans themselves and between Eastern and Western Europe. My question to Andrei Nacu, in your paper, but also a question and a remark. In your paper, but also in your film, there's a tension between the actual visual content and your narration, because I think that the actual visual content is very much fueled with positivity, and your narration, I'm not sure if it's conscious, it's a little bit negative, I would say. And I wonder, what's the potential of the family album? I would like you to elaborate a little bit more of the, kind of power of family album as to negotiate between this negative and positive sides, and to kind of demythologize the past of Romania. Considering Filip Lipiński paper, I wonder if the notion of Marian Hirsch post-memory really suits your argumentation, and because the notion of post-memory relates to second generation of Holocaust victims and other traumatic experiences. And it is fueled with a very deep, affective, personal relation, and it's saturated in family histories, which, as far as I know, is not Stella's case, perhaps. So I wonder if maybe, you know, some constellations of concepts connected to memory and migration would be of, you know, better help for you. And I love your beautiful formal analysis of the works. And I would like to ask you about one element you did not mention, i.e. the title. As we know, the title of the book which triggered this wonderful series is Wooden Synagogues. And the title of the series of Stella is Polish Villages, Wooden Synagogues, Polish Villages. And you know, I would like you to kind of interpret this Freudian slip, or perhaps the omission, how you see it. And considering Vitalii Ogiienko, The Little Starving Girl is a contemporary work. And I wonder what is the kind of space of encounter between this work, between this statue, and the historical testimonies of Holodomor. If the artist involved any visual material, yes, working on this sculpture, as Stella did, for example, yes, in his Polish Villages series. So what's the space of encounter? And I also have a remark, a very detailed remark. I think that this trauma, endemic trauma of Holodomor, it's not only a trauma of death. And I think you mentioned that in the written version of your paper. It's also trauma of losing bonds with the intimates, with the closest people, since the kids were endangered. And it's also a trauma of cannibalism. And there's a very interesting article by Ewa Domańska, a Polish historian, on a testimony of Polish secondary witness of Holodomor. Strangely, the secondary witness is mentioning again woman, yes? And he's talking about the experience, kind of after effects of cannibalism. And in his narration, this is what Ewa Domańska is analyzing. In his narration, there's a very strange process, the process of transhumanation. So talking about her losing humanity, he's also talking somehow, unconsciously, about his deeply veiled traumatic event. So that will be it for now, at least.
Thank you so much, Luiza. Can we collect now several questions from the audience, and then we'll give back the voice to the speakers, so then they will be able to answer Luiza's comments and questions from the audience. Anyone? Yes, please. If you could introduce yourself.
Yep, I'm a student in anthropology in University of Lyon 2 in France, and well, I'm interested in memory studies. Thank you for all your presentations. It's very stimulating. I have 2 questions, comments about the presentation of Andrei and Nacu. your project is very frustrating because I mean, I would like to see it at a global scale or a European scale, but well, have you seen, I don't know how exactly you collected and categorized the photos. You talked about the taxonomy and aesthetic point of view, but do you have a regional, where does the photos come from, and can you talk maybe about differences between regions inside of Romania? Maybe some patterns that appears in some regions and not others, to specify a little bit more the maps of these family albums. And my other question was remarking that you began that project thinking about your own family, right? And what was in the video was very interesting. Do you plan to go back to the families where your albums come from? And how can you imagine that process of collecting memories of these families from the albums? And in that sense, maybe the work of Elisabeth Helin in Argentina could help you. Thank you.
We have a question here.
My question goes to Florin. I do see some very negative aspect in your considerations. I don't think that, I mean, I lived through all those decades, not scientifically alone, but as well politically, since the destruction of the various communistic countries and some rise of some common European entity. I don't think that it is necessary to have that collective memory in the sense that each of those various nations find the same aspects in that European memory. I think it is possible that, of course, each nation has got its past for their national memories in that sense, and that only some 2 or 3 visionary aspects might be in the collective memory of Europe. That means seeing all those horrible negative processes as the wars, the national conflicts between bilateral nations, etc. That means the destructive element, which is possibly in the collective memory in all those nations, and seeing and learning from that at least 70 years of the peace process, there's no war in between those nations, a sort of rise in a welfare economy, etc. So there might be some common points in our collective memory as well. And this is my approach, at least. I see it from a positive perspective.
My name is Yulia Yurchuk. I'm a historian, and my questions are to Vitalii Ogiienko and Andrei Nacu. And first to Vitalii, I wonder, you finished your presentation with a list of questions to an artist, and I wonder what was the results. So what the artist said, and why this girl looks like she looks. And to Andrei, I really find this fascinating images of ball which is the same everywhere. And I wonder, is it some kind of it indicates on the economy of scarcity that there were no other balls, or it's like a technology, because I do remember that, for instance, from my childhood, which was in Soviet Ukraine, it was like me and several of my friends have the same images of like a bunny, and the simple answer on this question was like why we had all the same bunnies, because the photographer who made these photographs, he had this bunny and he was making these photographs of us, and none of us actually had that bunny. So it's just curiosity. What do you think about this ball?
Thank you. Anyone? Yeah, one more question.
Yes, thank you. Robert-Jan Adriaans, Erasmus University, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. My question is to Florin as well about the House of European History. I've got actually two questions. The first is about the extent to which we should use the concept of post-truth as an analytical concept. Well, what I found when I kind of investigated this concept was that it arose from a journalistic discourse, especially after Brexit and in the United States after the election of Donald Trump, as a mode of answering to themselves why they didn't really see these events coming. And the answer then was, well, they have deceived us, and we are now living in a post-truth era. So should we actually use that then as an analytical concept, because that would imply also the existence of, or the truth of more naive, realistic epistemologies? And the second question is about the House of European History. Well, coincidentally, I visited the House of European History a month ago with my master's students. And we did an analysis, or at least I let them do the analysis about the narrative of the museum. And what struck us was that the actually narrative of the museum itself kind of diverted from the intentions of the European Union. So they kind of gave it away, and what they also explained to us was that the way they approached it, the construction of this narrative, was actually by using the expertise of a lot of scholars and museum experts from throughout Europe, and they negotiated this narrative. So to what extent then are your conclusions, or a bit negative conclusions, I agree with the previous question, valid?
Anyone else? Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Victor Dia. I'm a photographer originally from Romania, but now based in UK, and I have to refer to Andrei's project as well. I've been looking at the idea of the family archive myself, but in a very restrictive mode. So based on his considerably larger experience, I was wondering, why do you think that there is a certain lack of interior photography when it comes to Romania? Do you think, so for example, when I look at the example of DDR, there are much more, there's a lot more presence of interior images that sort of led to the idea of nostalgia in a way. So in Romania, this is missing. Most of the images of the family pictures are outside images, and the interior ones are sort of taken by professional photographers. Do you think it's a matter of technology or the value, the perception of value of photography, or is it a social status, because most of them were taken during holidays? And yeah, based on your experience, what do you make of it?
Much, and we have room for one more question here, and then we'll go to answers. Tutaj.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for the super interesting presentations, and my question goes to Andrei as well. My name is Yael, I'm an artist, a filmmaker as well, and I was interested in relation between your own family album and kind of like extension of the research to other albums and photographs you found in flea markets, or kind of like this personal versus like a collective memory, maybe if there was any different than in your like kind of perception of these images. So it would be nice if you can elaborate on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And if I can add a very short question also to Andrei. Do you think the pictures, I mean, if you made a similar study with, let's say, Western democratic country, I don't know, Great Britain, do you think the British pictures from the same period, the family pictures, would be different? Or, and if yes, in what way? I do remember, for instance, there was a Ceausescu, the children from the kindergarten with Ceausescu, but maybe we could have a picture with Churchill. I mean, what makes Romania specific in this case? And now we go back to answers. I would like to ask you to stick to 4 minutes, if it's possible. And we start with the same, in the same order. So, Vitalii, if you could answer the questions, please.
Okay, first questions about the space of encounter. And I think that memory studies in general, it is about memory transmission. And it is the main problem, and I think the main puzzle, because we understand that memory, it is in part something from psychology and in part something from culture, from culturology, and how to combine, how to compare it. And I think that it is very difficult, or maybe it is impossible at all. But we can compare, and we can analyze cultural representation. For example, in my presentation, these 3 testimonies or narrations and this little statue, it is the same generally, because it is like representation. We can, of course, categorize them, say that these testimonies are secondary witness representation. This statue, it is created later, but it is the same, generally speaking. In Aleida Assmann put once that if something goes from original experience to sphere of culture, he wrote about text, about narration, but I think the general approach is the same in case of images as well. We can compare them and we can analyze them, and I think that it is this space of encounter. From these narratives, we can find out some markers or of this original experience, and to look if this marker is present or not present in this case of little starving girl. Even can compare them and analyze them, and it will be this space of encounter. Second question about trauma of death. I agree with you, of course, because death is my understanding. It is much more about individual memory, but not collective. If you look, for example, at theories of collective trauma by Vamik Volkan, American Turkish scientist, we see that there is almost nothing about death. Death is individual trauma, individual mourning. But in case of Holodomor, there are a lot of course, another markers or another most important characteristic of this trauma. One of them, for example, is educating people to be loyal to the system as a result of Holodomor. It is a very important feature, and it has nothing to do with trauma, with death. Or, for example, one characteristic is social masochism or sadomasochism. And I think that it is related to cannibalism, because cannibalism very often was connected not to desire to survive, but it was like to punish society for this terrible situation in which the society was trapped in. And of course, it is not about death. It's about some different characteristic, like educating loyalty and another characteristic. And concerning your question, if I have asked author of this statue what he think about, I not, but I have previous agreement with him to speak about this. And what is important for me before to speak with author of such artwork, it is important to better understand the period, better understand the memory flow, and to develop this questionnaire with regard to this knowledge. For example, in my case, it is knowledge about image of starving girls in period of Holodomor. Secondly, it is general understanding of the situation with trauma. For example, like a passage from repeating to PTSD markers, from repeating of trauma to numbing. And third aspect, it is mental representation. It means that everything what connects to Holodomor should be like silenced, like empty space, and it is important to keep in mind this feature even before you going to ask someone who created one or another piece of art about, and we should keep in mind this characteristic before even asking them his or her about this question.
Okay, thank you very much. Andrei?
Regarding this tension between the positive images and the negative narration, or this ambivalence, I think in general photographs are ambiguous, and this actually can be their strength, because you can talk about different things with the same images. And also I think the border between photography and memory is quite diffuse, and photography can block memory sometimes when we only remember what is seen in the picture, but also can serve as a trigger in order to bring back memories. In this dichotomy of anti-communism and demonization of this period and the nostalgia, I'm trying to actually place myself somewhere in between, and in the position of more into the position of raising questions and creating a context for debate rather than taking sides. Probably this, I think, it's the power of family album that I think can accommodate in this multi-layered memory. Regarding where the photos are collected from and if there are any regions, the way I was trying to make this selection was not, the taxonomy was not necessarily from an aesthetic point of view, but rather to identify situations or symbols that can mean something, not necessarily aesthetics. I've collected photos first from the family albums of my acquaintances. I was asking my friends and friends of friends to give me their family album to scan it, but also I've started to buy these images from flea markets. Because of logistics, I've pretty much concentrate myself in the northeastern region of the country, and also in Bucharest, where there's quite a few flea markets. So I don't know for any specific regions of the family album, but yeah, maybe in the future, if I'm going to collect more, maybe I'll find some differences. Yes, but I plan to go back and find out more stories about the photos. I mean, this was the idea of the exhibition in the block of flats. I was actually asking the people living there to share with me their photographs, and also I'm hoping to go back and ask them if made any difference to have those images in their living space, and how did they interact, and if this made any difference in remembering the past, or maybe interacting with their kids or whatever, if they are asking things about those photos. It's of course it's not the only ball in Romania from that period. There were many other balls, but I've only selected this just as a pretext, not necessarily for the ball, but rather just to force ourselves to look more of the context in which the ball is, and analyze more this background. I'm not sure if there is this big difference between interior photos and exterior photos. Might be a question of technology, because the interior photos are a bit harder to produce, but in the same time I think photography was really popular. There were many people with their bathroom transformed in a dark room. So and yeah, and also I think there are more events that are naturally included in a family album, which happens outside, like holidays and stuff like that, in comparison with events that are inside, like anniversaries or maybe weddings and stuff. Yeah, so maybe this could be an answer. The extension from my personal family to the collective memory, I think, was something that came naturally, because in the first place I wanted to understand my family history and how, what's my background, and how this influenced the way my parents are understanding their past and present now. So it was a natural step to ask myself what is the general picture with these photos. And about the UK photos, if are different, I think there are some sort of universal, but not universal, some common laws in building up these family albums where we try to idealize our family actually. But always depends, I think, how we look at these images. I mean, you mentioned this example with Ceausescu's portrait on the wall. Of course, this, for somebody who wants to read it as, look, this is a sign of the totalitarian regime and the cult of personality, can see this. But in the same time, maybe somebody else could see something about the free and universal education in Romania at that time, and how all the villages, or most of the villages, had a school, and all these other positive sides in the society. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Filip.
Luiza, I think that you two questions, the general question about the sphere of space of encounter, and your question related to my use of the notion of post-memory are somehow related. Because even though you, of course, write that initially the Marian Hirsch talked about the second generation, but then I think this notion traveled a little bit, even in her writings, and extended to and was used sometimes by some other authors interchangeably with this vicarious memory. So maybe that would be a sort of a safer choice. But at the same time, I think that from the 90s, when she was actually writing, introducing this term, up till now, we have this even stronger, at least possibility of experiencing the other's memory because of this very strong intermixing of the individual and the collective in various forms of mediation. So I would say that if you're an Orthodox, you wouldn't be able to talk about post memory in Stella's case, but if you're not, that is justified, and hence I think that there is this, especially today, there is a good chance of even though Stella is a good example of this sort of I believe unconscious or repressed sort of empathic or even affective response to history, which was not directly his own. And not even in terms of, I don't know about his ancestors, if they, in Italy, they someone, I don't know, were affected by Second World War or anything. But there is this, I think, potential in especially when we talk about art or visual projects or audiovisual projects, anyways, different ways of translating those experiences, like Stella did, like contemporary authors do. Sometimes they're more or less successful in translating this difficult, certain affective potential, because when we talk about affect, it's more like a potential into a certain form of or it has to be shaped somehow in order to allow or at least give a chance to the viewers or receivers, generally speaking, to connect with it somehow. So, well, I believe this is memory gets more, it's a cliche, but it gets more global, and I think at the same time it's more complicated in the sense that these issues are more complicated and so difficult to disentangle. When it comes to, I don't know if I somehow answered your question, but then there is this issue about the title. Stella's series was called right after he completed it in a variety of ways. It was like Polish project, Polish villages, Polish synagogues. They used a variety of names. I think that Polish villages, I might be wrong, I'll have to look it up, but was established during William Rubin's exhibition of Stella's work, Stella's later work in 1987. And this is interesting because I think that Polish villages is safer in a way, because the names of the works are actually the names not of synagogues, but of actual villages, sites, towns, little towns, or villages. So that this sort of a displacement of the original title of the publication, and I think again this sort of testifies to his, I think, will to sort of or attempt to somehow distance himself from this original kind of a source of inspiration, or change it somehow. This direct link to the historical anchorage of in Jewish culture and the traumatic history. So I guess that might be, it's just my speculation. I don't know about it specifically.
So thank you. I will try to deliver my answers in 4 minutes. For the beginning, thank you very much for the comments and questions. I need to clarify that my paper was written at the crossroads of three areas. first historiography, European governance studies, and communication studies. I explained that because at the faculty I teaching about the institutional communication in European Union. So I am preoccupied about the effects of what happened from Brussels into still 28 countries. So in this paper, I want to make a correlation between political discourse, one of them, of course, and the historical narrative, or between political narrative and historical narratives. Regarding the question of post-truth, of course, I agree with you, it's not very analytical, but it's very useful because to debate and not to say, wow, the social media, but to see also the negative effects on the societies and our societies, because it's very nice to stay here, but many times in our societies, population, the citizens are not, sometimes are very easy to be convinced using social media by people who not have so humanistic ideals. The question of European history, of course, was different between the concept, and I present here concept, and what was done 10 years after, because they are moderated somewhat what they want at the beginning, and they are not so radical into the idea of made as people who want to make tabula rasa historical or national past, because the past was defined and it was a narrative that nationalism and national identity, it was the source, of what of all bad things that are happened in the world. And to give you an answer, I'm forced to become self-referential, and I present my final words. Our main conclusion is that the European Union will preserve its force if its transnational elites, mainly I understand on this Euro bureaucracy, are not starting a conflict against historical identity and memory related to the nation state, but instead accept the reality that Europe has too strong historical tradition which cannot be easily removed. In fact, the European Union needs multiple and non-hegemonic Europeanization of his historical memories, including the identity mythology, and not a brutal attempt of rejection on behalf of the supposed anachronism. In fact, pan-European mythology cannot only dwell upon the memory of the two world wars, as you have in your memory. It needs positive examples that provide a real and convincing meaning of the European dream. And to give my support of what I saw at the beginning, I present one of the conclusions of a very new study. It's called European Political Tribes, or Europe's Political Tribes, made by Chatham House Institute of International Relations from London, and they identify 6 categories of identities into the European Union. First, so-called hesitant Europeans, 33%. Second, contented Europeans, mainly the young, 23%. EU rejectors, 14%. Frustrated pro-Europeans, 9%. Austerity rebels, 9%. And federalists, 8%. And to be more easy understand, in paper I correlated the narrative with what happened in election, in the European election, in Germany, in France, here in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Britain, in your country. And I am looking at what happened, not at my wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, well, now, I think we can consider, the panel as fruitful and over. We'll have a lunch right now, and at the lunch break, you can still discuss these things, including what's the construction. Is the European Union construction, or a nation is a construction, or how to make a good museum. Thank you so much.
Thank you.